They laughed first. Not because you were weak, but because they couldn't read you. You stayed quiet while they measured power in noise, ego, and attention. They mistook your restraint for confusion, your silence for fear. So they tested you. And that's when the air shifted, because what they touched wasn't emotion, it was discipline. Not reaction, awareness. You weren't playing the same game. You were operating on a level they didn't even believe existed. Silence was never emptiness. It was containment. While they were busy filling every room with opinions, explanations, defenses, you were busy observing the architecture of the room itself. You understood something most people never do. Noise is usually a confession. The loud explain themselves because they're afraid of being misunderstood. The quiet don't rush because they already know who they are. You let pauses do the talking. You let eye contact finish sentences they were desperate to start. They thought your silence meant uncertainty, hesitation, maybe even fear. That was cute. Silence was your shield because it denied them access. No emotional entry points. No reactive leverage. No impulsive tells. They tried jokes, provocations, subtle disrespect, even praise disguised as curiosity, and each time they got nothing back. That unsettled them. People rely on reactions the way gamblers rely on patterns. When you don't react, the game collapses. They couldn't read your next move because you weren't broadcasting one. You weren't hiding either. You were simply not volunteering yourself for inspection. You learned early that explaining yourself is often an act of submission. The moment you over-clarify, you hand someone authority they didn't earn. So you stayed still. You listened longer than expected. You smiled at moments that confused them. You answered questions with fewer words than required, sometimes none at all. Silence became a mirror, and most people hate mirrors. They don't want to see themselves rushing, projecting, exposing motives they pretend not to have. They mistook your restraint for weakness, because restraint scares people who live unrestrained. To them, power looks loud, control looks aggressive, confidence must announce itself. They didn't realize that silence is expensive. It costs awareness. It costs patience. It costs ego. Anyone can react. Anyone can argue. Anyone can defend. Very few can sit in stillness while others spiral around them, trying to pull something out. Silence also protected your inner rhythm. While they were emotionally sprinting, you were pacing. While they were triggered by tone, by implication, by imagined disrespect, you were choosing what deserved energy. You knew energy is currency, and you don't hand currency to people who can't manage it. Every unspoken response was a boundary. Every pause was a quiet no. They felt it even if they couldn't articulate it. That's why they kept pushing. They tested your silence because it threatened their sense of control. Silence doesn't argue back, so they couldn't win. Silence doesn't confess, so they couldn't dissect you. Silence doesn't chase approval, so they couldn't bait you with validation or with rejection. Your calm disrupted their hierarchy. It made them wonder who you were listening to if not them. It made them question whether you were even playing the same social game. And the truth is, you weren't. You weren't there to dominate conversations. You weren't there to perform intelligence or morality. You were there to see, to feel the undercurrents, to notice how quickly people reveal themselves when they're uncomfortable with quiet. Your silence absorbed their projections and gave nothing back, and that imbalance drove them restless. They started filling the gaps themselves, exposing insecurities, motivations, little fractures in their confidence. Silence was your shield, because it kept your center untouched. They could throw assumptions, labels, misinterpretations, and none of it stuck, because you didn't grab it. You let it fall to the floor where it belonged. You understood that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the loudest or the angriest, but the one who doesn't need to be seen to be present. The one who can wait. The one who lets others exhaust themselves, trying to figure out what they mean. They thought they were testing you, but what they really did was expose the distance between where they operate and where you exist. Their test wasn't intentional wisdom. It was instinct. People test what they don't understand. They poke, provoke, apply pressure, not to learn, but to confirm their own assumptions. They expected you to flinch, to defend, to reveal something predictable. That expectation already told you everything. They were playing on a level where outcomes are familiar, where reactions are currency, where control feels possible. Their test came disguised as curiosity, as challenge, as disrespect wrapped in humor. Sometimes it came as doubt, sometimes as subtle comparison, sometimes as an invitation designed to pull you down to where they feel powerful. They didn't call it a test. They never do. Tests are always framed as just seeing, just asking, just joking. But you recognize the pattern. You could feel the tension behind their words, the hunger for confirmation that you were no different, no deeper, no stronger than the version they had already created in their head. And that's when the test failed. Not because you resisted it, but because you didn't participate the way they expected. You didn't rise to the bait. You didn't shrink either. You stayed centered, and that center didn't move. Their pressure met something solid, not reactive, not defensive. Awareness doesn't announce itself. It just holds. The moment they realized their test wasn't producing the reaction they needed, confusion crept in. Confusion is dangerous for people who rely on control. They tested you emotionally first. A comment meant to unsettle. A tone meant to dominate. You didn't absorb it. They escalated. They tested your patience, your boundaries, your ego. They waited for irritation, for pride, for justification. What they encountered instead was restraint without suppression, calm without numbness, presence without performance. That's when the air shifted. People feel that shift before they understand it. It makes them uneasy. Their test revealed your level, because levels aren't proven by words. They're exposed under pressure. Anyone can sound enlightened when nothing challenges them. Anyone can talk about growth when there's no friction. But when someone presses where they expect weakness and finds structure instead, the illusion breaks. They realized you weren't managing emotions. You had mastered them. You weren't avoiding conflict. You had outgrown unnecessary ones. You weren't passive. You were selective. That realization hit them quietly at first. Then it started to echo. They began replaying the interaction in their head, searching for leverage they missed. They questioned whether they pushed too far or not far enough. They wondered what you saw that they didn't. Tests are supposed to reassure the tester. This one destabilized them. It flipped the dynamic. Suddenly, you weren't the subject anymore. They were. They saw that your reactions weren't automatic. They were chosen. That scared them more than aggression ever could. Aggression can be predicted. Calm awareness cannot. They understood, maybe subconsciously, that you weren't driven by validation, fear, or impulse. You weren't trying to win the moment. You were operating from alignment, not adrenaline. From depth, not dominance. Their test revealed your level because it exposed the limits of theirs. They came at you with tools that work on people who are still negotiating their worth. You weren't negotiating. You weren't proving. You weren't explaining. You let the test play out without resisting it, and in doing so, you turned it into a mirror. What they saw wasn't you failing or passing. What they saw was themselves struggling to access you. That's when respect starts to form, or resentment. Some people retreat after that. Others become obsessed. Because once someone realizes you're operating on a level they can't manipulate, they either rise or they plot. And you can always tell which one they choose by how often they bring up the moment. You didn't react the way they needed. They live for reaction. That's the fuel. A raised voice, a tightened jaw, a defensive explanation, anything that confirms they still have access to you. Reaction makes them feel relevant. It reassures them that they can still reach inside and rearrange something. You learned early that the moment you react without awareness, you hand over the steering wheel. So you stopped confusing impulse with honesty and emotion with truth. Awareness doesn't rush. It watches the urge to speak rise, peak, and dissolve. While they were waiting for you to snap, you were noticing how predictable the provocation was. Same patterns, different faces. The comment designed to sting. The pause designed to intimidate. The smirk designed to suggest superiority. You didn't take the bait because you could see the hook. Once you see the hook, the hunger disappears. They called your calm indifference. They called your restraint avoidance. People always mislabel what they can't access. Awareness feels cold to those who are ruled by heat. But what they never saw was the internal discipline required to choose response over reaction. Reaction is automatic. Response is deliberate. One leaks power. The other concentrates it. You felt the surge when they tried to push you. The body always reacts first. The difference is what you do next. Instead of letting that surge escape through words or gestures, you let it inform you. You listened to what the discomfort was pointing at. Was this worth energy? Was this aligned? Was this necessary? Most of the time, the answer was no, so nothing happened. That silence wasn't suppression. It was filtration. They grew frustrated because they couldn't trigger you into revealing yourself. Every reaction they failed to extract weakened their position. People who rely on emotional control panic when it stops working. They double down, they escalate, they test boundaries harder. And each time, your awareness widened instead of collapsing. You started noticing how their provocations said more about their insecurities than about your behavior. Awareness over reaction also meant you weren't trying to correct misunderstandings. You let them misunderstand. You let them project. You let them create stories. Correcting every false narrative is a full-time job for people who need approval. You didn't. You understood that truth doesn't require constant defense. It just remains. Those who are aligned with it recognize it. Those who aren't reveal themselves through their agitation. They wanted immediacy. You offered presence. They wanted dominance. You offered composure. That contrast made them uncomfortable, because awareness is quiet power. It doesn't chase. It doesn't argue. It doesn't announce itself. It just removes you from the emotional economy they're trading in. No supply, no demand, no transaction. You noticed how often people regret reactions, but rarely regret restraint. Reaction gives instant relief and long-term consequences. Awareness delays relief and dissolves consequences before they form. You weren't numb. You felt everything. You just didn't let feelings make decisions. That's the part they never understood. They assumed you didn't care. In reality, you cared enough not to let chaos decide your behavior. Every moment you chose awareness, you trained your nervous system to trust stillness. You didn't need to win arguments, because you weren't trying to dominate perception. You weren't trying to be right in front of people who thrive on conflict. You were protecting clarity. Clarity doesn't survive in reaction. It survives in space. And that's what made you dangerous in their eyes. Not unpredictable rage. Not loud confidence. But the ability to pause where they would explode. To observe where they would attack. To choose where they would react. Because once someone realizes you are no longer governed by provocation, they realize they've lost their favorite weapon. They tried everything to pull something out of you. Pressure, praise, doubt, provocation. Each move was calculated to spark a reaction they could recognize, something familiar, something manageable. When none of it worked, the realization crept in slowly, and then all at once. The power they relied on only exists when someone agrees to play. You never did. They couldn't provoke you because there was nothing loose to grab. No exposed ego begging to be validated. No insecurity waiting to be poked. No emotional debt they could collect on. What they mistook for detachment was actually integration. You weren't suppressing parts of yourself. You had already met them, understood them, and put them in their place. That made you inaccessible. Provocation works on people who are still negotiating with their inner chaos. A comment lands, a nerve lights up, and suddenly the outside world is in control. You had already done that negotiation in private. You knew your triggers. You knew your patterns. So when they tried to activate them, nothing happened. They were pressing buttons that no longer existed. That's when their frustration turned into obsession. People hate unanswered power. They hate not knowing where the edge is. They kept escalating, thinking volume would replace substance. Louder comments, sharper tones, subtle disrespect masked as honesty. They were trying to force a crack, any crack, just to prove you were human in the way they needed you to be. But all they did was reveal how dependent they were on reaction. You could feel the shift in the room when they realized their usual tactics were useless. The jokes landed flat. The intimidation fell hollow. Even the silence they tried to weaponize didn't work because you were already comfortable there. They expected discomfort. What they got was composure. That contrast unsettled them more than anger ever could. The power they couldn't provoke was internal. It didn't rise when challenged. It didn't need to assert itself. It didn't crave recognition. It stayed where it was. That kind of power doesn't leak through words or gestures. It's felt. People sense it in posture, in timing, in the absence of urgency. It's the calm of someone who doesn't need the moment to go a certain way. They tried to bait you into defending your choices, your silence, your presence. Defense would have given them entry. You gave them none. You understood that explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding is a form of surrender. So you let them sit with their confusion. Confusion is unbearable for those who rely on certainty to feel superior. As they failed to provoke you, their behavior became more revealing. You watched impatience creep into their voice. You saw irritation in their movements. The mask slipped. Provocation always exposes the provoker eventually. When control fails, insecurity takes over. You didn't have to expose them. They did it themselves in real time while you remained still. What made this unbearable for them was the realization that you weren't resisting. Resistance can be pushed against. You were absent from the emotional battlefield entirely. You had stepped outside the cycle of stimulus and response they lived in. That absence removed their influence. Without influence, their sense of importance collapsed. They left the interaction unsettled, replaying it in their head, trying to locate the moment they lost leverage. They wondered if they underestimated you or overestimated themselves. The answer was both. They walked away with unanswered questions and an unfamiliar feeling of smallness, not because you made them feel inferior, but because you refused to make them feel anything at all.